Team Sennhenn of GSI Darmstadt. She will speak about low-dose hypersensitivity and their newest results. So.
Can I see this screen? Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your announcement. I would like to talk about the phenomenon of hyperradiosensitivity and now how this is influenced by the type of radiation under consideration. Sorry, it doesn't work. Yeah, different types of radiation deposit their energy very differently in cells. So just to give a small recap, so hopefully everybody can follow the rest of the talk. Photon radiation, like gamma radiation, deposits the energy very diffusely, whereas ion radiation deposits the energy very densely, so like alpha particles. And this is often characterized in terms of LET. And so high LET radiation, because of the dense ionizations, also causes more localized damages to the radiation-sensitive target, so the cell's DNA, which then makes it harder for the cell to repair and therefore affects the biological responses. One way to quantify biological responses is by using cell survival curves. In experiments, the cell survival is measured as a function of dose. And then often a simple two-parameter model is used to fit the cell survival data, the LQ model with just a linear parameter alpha and a quadratic parameter. But actually what we see when we now investigate very low doses is that we can see deviations from this behavior. And so hyperradiosensitivity, HRS, refers to an unexpectedly high sensitivity at very low doses. And now our key question was, does HRS behave differently for alpha particles, which is interesting for us in the case of exposure scenarios. And for that, we combined two modeling approaches previously developed in work package 3.6, and we even used one of the travel grants for research states, so Szabolcs came to visit me at GSI to collaborate on this. So just to recap also the models that this is based on, so the minimum mutation load model that Szabolcs also presented last year, it explains HRS that the biological rationale is that cells go into additional voluntary cell death if this can be beneficial to the overall tissue. So I will try to break this down, the idea of this model. So when there's radiation and damages, the cell detects the damage and then compares its damage to the damage of the surrounding cells. And then if the damage of the single cell is higher than the average, then it makes sense for the cell to go into apoptosis, or voluntary cell death, so it can be replaced by a healthy cell. And congratulations also to the authors for submitting this model. The other model, the second model we use, is a model that was established originally at my institution. It's an RBE model, so the idea is to predict the increased effectiveness of ion radiation based on the cell's response to photon radiation. And so you can imagine it as a kind of black box model, because the idea is to not consider all the underlying biological processes, but rather rely on that the biological information is contained in the cell's response to the photon radiation, and then also take into account the different physical characteristics that the ion radiation has to then predict a cell response to ions like alpha particles. Yeah, this is something that I also presented last year, because actually in the case of alpha particles, it was not so easy to use this model because alpha particles have low energy, so a lot of the assumptions that I usually made in modeling break down. So you have to take into account that because the particles are slow, they can even get stuck within the cell, and all the physical characteristics that are assumed to be constant can change. Also, we usually assume that the whole the whole nucleus is just a radiation-sensitive target, but and this is okay for high energies. where all of the nucleus can receive some dose, but when we move to low energies in the case of alpha particles, the ionization pattern becomes so small that you can shoot through the nucleus without hitting sensitive regions, and this has also been submitted for publication. This model we then finally use to finally be able to apply it in the case of low dose alpha particle exposure. So here, coming back to this model that is often used in radiation research, this linear quadratic survival model. Our idea was that we actually take two components into account. So additionally, that there can be this apoptosis, so voluntary cell death, if this is beneficial for the overall tissue. So the survival curves you will see from now on will be a combination of these two approaches. So since we usually have a lot more data available on photon radiation, the idea was then to fit our model to available photon data and then see how the LET affects the dose responses. And so for that we use this model, this local effect model that I previously introduced twice. Once, like it was conventionally used to predict these simple Q parameters, but now we also use it a second time. I didn't have time to introduce the model parameters in detail, but the MML model developed by Sabolcha and Balash, we developed analytical formulation for this, and we have some parameters that only depend on the biological system, but also this radiation-dependent parameter. And this is now the one that we can also predict using this RBE model. So then, now here you can finally see the predicted survival curves that I will now show you for different LET values. And you can already see that compared to photons, when you go to alpha particle irradiation, that the survival curves kind of seems compressed, because at the same physical dose, the biological processes, because of this more complex damage that I was referring to earlier, just appear earlier. And so you can see this behavior with increasing LET, survival curves become more and more condensed, until the highest LET value, you cannot see this traditional traces of hyperradiosensitivity that we are used to, so a dip with a hypersensitive region, and then also often this recovery is seen, often called induced radio resistance. But so now when we're in the LET range of alpha particles, we can see that we have a steep initial offset, and then the survival curve decreases. So these were just our model predictions, and now to come to the validation part. So we found an experiment, a set of experimental data where there was there was an experiment with photon radiation, and under the same conditions then experiments with alpha particles. And so we then used the model to fit this experimental photon data. And now, like I was explaining before, we then predict the survival curves for different alpha particle energies using our model approach. And now you can see the experimental measurements. And so for the lower LET values in the low dose region, actually also the uncertainties are very high. And here you can see that when the LET is not so high yet, it's even hard to distinguish between the photon and the alpha particle data. But going towards the highest LET, the experimental data also shows what we predicted, that you can see this kind of initial offset and a very steep drop in survival. And also for the higher doses, actually it's remarkable considering how many assumptions or how many models we used to get here, that we are in the range of the experimental data. And so now coming more towards risk estimates, what I've been talking about so far is that the radiation damage induced can give rise to cell death, but it can also cause viable mutations, meaning that mutations remain undetected, or they affect some regions of the cell that then provide a growth advantage. And these are actually competing processes. So as my supervisor likes to say, you can only die of cancer with 80 if you survived until you're 80. So the idea is that at very high doses, the risk is high of getting of cells transforming, but also the cell survival is so low that the overall risk, now here shown in green, actually then decreases at some point with higher doses. And what is novel now here is that if we say that we actually have this hyperradiosensitive region also for alpha particles, and we have this initial decrease in cell death at low doses, then this actually also translates into a slightly decreased risk. Yeah, so that with that I would like to conclude that HRS highlights that low dose responses can be more complex than classical models like the LQ model that I showed in the beginning predict. And so for that reason we developed a mechanistic model for high BT radiation. I try to break it down a lot, but it's actually a much more detailed model than is often used in radiation research. And we tested it against experimental data, also against the HRS database that was also developed within the group. And yes, we could see that alpha particles can cause severe cell death even at low doses, and that this reduces the chance of damaged cells finally persisting. And so this also all feeds into the Sustainable Development Goal 3, for good health and well-being, that we have the need for biologically informed models like the one that I presented today. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.